Hey everyone, welcome to a brief mini-series in which I'm going to show you how to take a standard 10-gallon aquarium and transform it into a vertical 10-gallon vivarium. So this is going to be a 6-part series, and this is part 1 of course, in which I'm going to show you how to actually convert this into a vivarium. In episode 2 I'm going to show you how to make a custom background. In episode 3 I'm going to show you how to make a very effective and really cool false bottom. In episode 4 I'm going to show you how to put soil in here and stock it with plants. And in episode 5, I'm going to stock it, and I'll probably have a 6th, 7th, maybe more episodes after that, even though I said it was only going to be a 6th part, which the series itself will technically only be 6 parts, but there might be additional ones after that, which it will make sense as this series goes on. But in episode 6, I'm going to show you how to do prolonged maintenance and all that sort of thing. So, in any effect, let's get started on converting this into a vivarium. I must mention that there are many ways that you could convert this aquarium, and there are kits available. However, I wanted to do it from scratch to show you how simple and cheap it is to convert an aquarium into a vertical vivarium without the use of a kit. That being said, you can alter this procedure for use on any aquarium size, just choose thicker acrylic as needed. I will also mention that you can alter all of the procedures within this process as you see fit. To begin, we are going to need a sheet of acrylic. I have a 24 by 48 inch sheet that is 1/10 of an inch thick. You can go thicker, but this will work well for a 10 gallon. I don't suggest going much thinner than this for a 10 gallon though. I'm going to use this sheet across 4 10-gallon aquariums, so it only costs $7 for each tank, which is relatively inexpensive. You will also need an acrylic cutter, which you can get for about $4. Further, you will need a marker, some clamps, and something to measure with. Get your measuring device and take the measurements of the aquarium's frame from the inside. This size is pretty standard, but it differs slightly sometimes. I ended up with these measurements. You can record your measurements right onto the acrylic as you see here, or make a guide with a piece of plywood if you're doing several tanks. If you have a big piece of acrylic like this, figure out what is the best use of the sheet by making a diagram. Keep in mind that you could always use the scraps for something else. I always double check my measurements just to make sure I got them right. Once cut, you can't go back, so try to get it right the first time. Now it's time to cut the acrylic. It's a good idea to have some test pieces to cut if you aren't familiar with this process. For this, you will need your clamps, something to cut along, and preferably a board. As you can see, I'm using this metal yardstick clamped in place to ensure that my cut lines stay straight. Now get your cutter and press firmly into the acrylic and pull it toward you. Run it along the line several times until you have a noticeable groove in the acrylic. You will know that it's working if shavings of acrylic are peeling out. Also, make sure you get the spot closest to you. I find that it's easy to miss. Next, move the sheet to the end of the table so that the groove hangs just off the edge. Then, clamp the board over top of the acrylic just along the edge of the table. After doing so, simply push down on the piece of acrylic that is hanging off until it snaps along the groove. To prevent cracking or an uneven cut, apply pressure closer to the groove on both sides. After snapping the acrylic, use a blade to cut along the protective plastic and separate the pieces. Now we must repeat the same process again to get the acrylic to the right size. Now let's see if the pieces fit. With any luck, your acrylic sheet should fit snugly into your aquarium's frame. Now we have to cut this piece into 3 others. We will have a bottom piece which will hold the false bottom and substrate into the vivarium, the middle piece which will act as a door, and the top which will be our ventilation area. You can alter these measurements however you see fit. For mine, I made the bottom section 3 inches tall and the top 1.5 inches, with the middle piece taking the rest. I marked each piece just to be sure that I know what I am working with. Now we are going to use the same procedures from before to cut the acrylic along these lines. After doing so, you should end up with 3 pieces as you see here. Now we are going to silicone the top and bottom pieces in place. Before doing so, we must clean our surfaces with rubbing alcohol. This will ensure that our silicone adheres optimally. The acrylic is already clean, so no need to use it on there. Also, make sure to clean the underside of the frame inside of the aquarium as we will be applying silicone here as well. As you will see, I'm using black silicone for this demonstration. In most cases though, silicone doesn't adhere to acrylic. That being said, there is silicone designed specifically for use with plastics, and usually it's sold near the acrylic. I suggest using something like this, otherwise I can't guarantee this process. When working with silicone, it is good to note that wet silicone wipes off with a dry paper towel, so if you make a mess, it's easy to clean. First, we are going to apply silicone to the inside of the frame. We are doing this because aquariums aren't fabricated to handle water in this area. Although we won't have a lot of water in here, we want to ensure that it's properly sealed. You don't have to do much of the tank though. Reference your bottom piece and then place your bead accordingly. After laying down a nice silicone bead, smooth it out with your finger. Now we are going to attach our acrylic pieces to the aquarium. At this point, you can take the protective plastic off of the top and bottom pieces. Leave it on the middle piece though. I began putting down some masking tape to ensure the consistency of the seal. You don't have to do this, and I found that it was more trouble than it was probably worth. After doing so, run a generous bead of silicone where your bottom piece of acrylic will go. Next, set the acrylic in place and push it down firmly. Now run a generous bead of silicone along the outside of the acrylic as seen here. Then smooth it out with your finger. At this point, you can also wipe off any excess silicone with a paper towel. Now, if you used masking tape, gently remove it. It's hard to do this without moving the acrylic, but that's fine so long as it's only slightly. After removing the tape, go back and apply pressure to the acrylic to ensure that it's firmly attached. You can also apply another small bead of silicone around the edge as seen here. Now we will attach the top piece using the same procedure as the bottom. However, you don't need to apply silicone to the inside of the aquarium. As you can see by this point, I decided that the tape was a nuisance. Apply the initial bead on the frame and then firmly press the acrylic in place. Now run the next bead of silicone on the outside and smooth it with your finger as before. Let the silicone cure for at least 2 to 4 hours on the top and bottom pieces before doing the next step. If it's dry to the touch, then you are in business. I suggest going back with the razor blade to clean any excess silicone like so. Be sure not to get the blade into the seal though. Now we're going to drill ventilation holes into the top piece of acrylic. As you can see, I made a guide on the computer and printed it out to ensure that my holes were relatively even. You could go about this many ways, but this is how I prefer to work. I taped the guide onto the acrylic and began drilling holes with a 1/16 inch bit. Keep in mind that we want our vivarium to retain humidity while also allowing airflow, so don't go overboard. For this reason, I wouldn't suggest using a bit any larger than 3/32 of an inch. After drilling all of your holes, remove the guide and clear the surface using something like this microfiber cloth. For the next step, we will need some small screws and hinges. As you can see, I'm using 3/4 inch hinges and 3/8 inch wood screws. Whatever you can find should work, just prep your acrylic accordingly. I wanted my hinges to be black and I couldn't find any, so I painted them. Now let's prep the acrylic. Again, I made myself a guide to ensure that my holes were consistent. The purpose of these holes are to screw the bottom piece of acrylic into place using our wood screws. Choose a bit slightly smaller than the diameter of the screw and drill away. These screws will help relieve stress that the door will put on this piece of acrylic when opened. If this doesn't make sense, it will shortly. As you can see, I have included a spot on my guide for the hinges. Use this to make sure that your hinges are evenly spaced. I messed up doing this the first time, as you will see shortly. No worries though, you can hardly notice. After removing your guide, you can put the screws and hinges in place. Throughout this process, make sure to keep the protective plastic on the middle piece of acrylic. We won't remove it until later in this series. After getting all of the screws in, we need to cover them up with silicone so that they don't rust and so that the enclosure remains properly sealed. You're also probably wondering about the screws on the door. We won't take care of these until later on in the series. Don't worry, they won't be sticking out like this. Next, we're going to add some magnets to the door. This part is optional, but it's a nice feature in my opinion. Plus, the magnets are pretty cheap. I got this pack of neodymium magnets for $4. First, we will add 2 of them to the inside of our vivarium. In doing so, simply put a dab of silicone on the magnet and press it onto the frame. You may have to remove some of the frame silicone to get the magnet completely under the frame as you see here. After getting the magnets in place, completely cover them with silicone. Just like the screws, this will keep them from rusting. After doing so, we will revisit the magnets shortly. Now we are going to add some handles to our door. You can use various different kinds, but I think ones like this are the easiest and cheapest solution. Here you can see the holes from when I messed up drilling for the hinges. I used them as guides to determine where my handles should go. After deciding that the placement looked good, I marked my acrylic. Then I drilled the holes for them. To prevent the acrylic from cracking, start out with a small bit and gradually work your way up to the size that you need. When you get to the larger bits, you may need to hold your door like so. The reason I liked handles like this is that they simply squeeze right into place. No need to attach anything on the inside unless desired. Now we will return to the magnet. You could attach the ones on the outside using silicone, but I used hot glue just to make the process go a little faster. Make sure to test your magnets before you apply the adhesive. The magnets will only attach to each other if the opposite sides are linked. I should also mention that I painted mine black so that they blend to the rest of the enclosure. Simply put a dab of your adhesive element onto the correct side of the magnet, peel back some of the protective plastic, and let it attach itself. After doing so, you can re-adhere the protective plastic. Next, you can treat your handles however you see fit. I simply painted mine black to keep with the theme of the enclosure. After doing so, peel back some of the plastic and put them in place. Now we will add a locking mechanism. In some cases, the magnets will be sufficient enough to keep the door closed, but we should add a closing mechanism just to be sure. There are various kinds that you could use, but a hook and staple like this is probably the cheapest and easiest solution to implement. Plus, it's pretty low profile and fits the aesthetic of our new vivarium. To attach this, you could simply make a guide as before. I didn't think it was necessary for myself, so I just used a ruler for reference. I was able to simply expand one of the ventilation holes for the hook, and then I marked for the staple. After marking the acrylic, drill your holes accordingly. Attach your staple first, and then loosely attach the hook. For it to work properly, it doesn't need to be very tight. After getting it properly attached, we will need to snip the screws. I used wire cutters, which made this pretty difficult. There are other tools that you could use though that would make the job much easier. The last thing that we want to check is to make sure that our vivarium holds water. If you followed the procedures as shown, you shouldn't have any issues. Keep in mind that you will never have this much water in your vivarium, but it's good to overdo just to make sure that it's working well. Let your water sit for at least 15 minutes to make sure that all is well, and then siphon out the water. That's it, you have successfully converted a 10-gallon aquarium into a vertical 10-gallon vivarium. There are a few other things that we will do to finalize our conversion, but we will discuss them throughout the remainder of this series.